This video is actually rated E for everyone. Huh. I was one day walking along Kearny Street in San Francisco when I noticed a crowd in front of the show window of a store. They were looking at something inside. I took a glance myself, but saw only a poor picture of an uninteresting landscape. As I was turning away, my eye caught these words underneath the picture. "Do you see the cat?" I looked again more closely, but I saw no cat. Then I spoke to the crowd. "Gentlemen," I said, "I do not see a cat in the picture. Is there a cat there?" Someone in the crowd replied, "Nah, there ain't no cat there. Here's a crank who says he sees a cat in it, but none of the rest of us can." Then the crank spoke up. "I tell you," he said, "there is a cat there. The picture is all cat. What you fellows take for a landscape is nothing more than the cat's outlines. And you needn't call a man a crank either, because he can see more with his eyes than you can with yours." Well, I looked again very closely at the picture, and then I said to the man they were calling a crank, "Really, sir, I cannot make out a cat in that picture. I can see nothing but a poor drawing of a commonplace landscape." I looked again, and was just on the point of replying that there was no cat's tail there that I could see, when suddenly the whole cat stood out before me. There it was, sure enough, just as the crank had said. And the only reason the rest of us couldn't see it was that we hadn't got the right angle of view, but now that I saw the cat, I could see nothing else in the picture. The poor landscape had disappeared, and a fine-looking cat had taken its place. And do you know, I was never afterwards able, upon looking at that picture, to see anything in it but the cat. It was hard to approach talking about the board game Monopoly because it's so well understood. Do I explain the process of going around the board, buying property, needing all of one color to add buildings, exacting rent to get people booted out? I decided to take it for granted that you know all of that already, and instead talk about the parts of Monopoly that don't get as much consideration. Compared to other popular board games, Monopoly is unique in how many different kinds of game pieces it has. Typically, card games and board games don't mix. You can have a card game that uses dice and tokens, or you could have a board game that uses dice and tokens. But cards, in conjunction with board games, leaves you with an imprecise board game or a messy card game. In total, Monopoly includes the board, dice, property cards, player tokens, chance cards, community chest cards, buildings, and money. Even Risk, with its global scope, doesn't have this many types of moving pieces. Monopoly also involves a secondary player role just to account for all of these tokens, cards, lands, buildings, and especially the money. The first time you played the game, a parent or teacher was probably the dedicated banker, so by the time you are trusted with counting out the money for everyone, it feels like a rite of passage instead of dedicated busywork. So you just roll with it. Monopoly is so well understood that the rules are an extension of the English language. You find it in judicial decisions.
In her ruling, Chutkan said the office of the president does not confer a lifelong get-out-of-jail-free pass.
And in movies.
Do not pass go! Do not collect $200!
1, 2, 3.
Go!
Do not pass go directly to McDonald's.
It's such a part of our culture that it's hard to imagine a time before Monopoly. That's probably because Parker Brothers would prefer that we forgot that before Monopoly, there was the Landlord's game, designed by Elizabeth Magie and iterated on from 1902 to 1939. It's really interesting going back and comparing the Monopoly of today to the Landlord's game. so much of the core experience of Monopoly is already present. The shape of the board, the property, renting and buying land, chance cards, pass and go to get money. Even in its earliest iterations, the board has a bit of personality. Here, the go to jail section is Lord Blueblood's estate, with a no trespassing sign. In the 1939 version, the different locations are presented like a map with different locales of the city highlighted. Interesting how so many public institutions are grouped around the richer locations. There's no free parking space, but heck, free parking wasn't a thing back then either. This was a game designed before the Model T. Who knows how that space works anyways? The playtesters weren't the sort to have something lavish like an automobile. Miss Maggie and her friends in the Quaker community in Brentwood, Maryland playtested the game. As the game was passed around to other Quaker communities, players didn't always have the original board or all the pieces, so they'd substitute with household items they had available, like sewing thimbles, another element that persists today. Miss Maggie created 2 sets of rules for her game. A Monopolist set, in which the goal was to create monopolies and crush opponents, and an anti-monopolist set, in which all were rewarded when wealth was created. Her dualistic approach was a teaching tool meant to demonstrate that the latter rules are morally superior.
The object of this game is not only to afford amusement to players, but to illustrate to them how, under the present or prevailing system of land tenure, the landlord has an advantage over other enterprises, and also how the single tax would discourage land speculation.
A single tax? Who comes up with this? Henry George was born into a poor family in Philadelphia in 1839. His formal education stopped at 14, he married at 18, and had 4 children. Around child 2, he had no work, his family no money, and he had to beg on the street. At his lowest, he thought he may even turn to robbery if no one took pity on him and his family. But he did eventually find work as a printer for the San Francisco Times, rising up to be the paper's managing editor. Something didn't add up, though. He was witness to so much poverty, and yet the economy was booming. He thought the source of the contradiction was land ownership. Landlords don't need to do any work, and yet they reap the benefits of people doing actual labor on top of the land they own. Henry George thought no one had a claim to the land. In Mr. George's words, land is the bounty of the Creator, a God-given gift to humanity. Claiming sole ownership of such a gift is theft. If there is a property owner, say a landlord of an apartment complex, he thought that they should pay everyone else rent for the land value they exploit. Land value is the total worth of a plot of land, not just how good the soil is or the things in the ground like gold or oil, but the value it gets from its proximity to everything else. An apartment is rated well on sites like Zillow if it has good internet, electricity, plumbing, is close to work, good schools, and public transportation. It's rated based on its land value. That land value is the cat, the thing that exists due to the surroundings that gives it shape and purpose. Land value is often lumped into property value, but that has some interesting side effects. For example, what if someone owned some row houses in West Baltimore? It's a great place to invest if you're a fan of The Wire, or lead, or asbestos. Under the current system, it makes no sense for, say, ABC Capital to improve their investment properties because they would have to pay higher property taxes. To get the most bang from your lead-infested buck, you may intentionally keep from developing your property until you see action from the government to make Baltimore financially attractive. Maybe they'll dredge the inner harbor. When a city has enough landowners waiting around for someone else to make the first move, there'll be whole neighborhoods full of unused and dilapidated buildings. If the land was the expensive part of owning property, corporations might not be so comfortable squatting on it for years, doing nothing. If Elizabeth Maggie set out to make the Landlord's game, and by extension Monopoly explained this, why doesn't everyone know about it? I think that has a lot to do with how playing with the board game and playing around with it highlights more systemic issues than was originally intended. If you haven't played either Monopoly or the Landlord's game before, feel free to pause the video to give it a go. The video will still be here when your game is over next week.
We'll be back after this short break.
This episode is brought to you by the Landlord's game. Can't figure where you left that box of Monopoly? None of the new editions catching your interest? You mean you haven't always wanted to be a landlord in the Shire? How about Monopoly now with credit card debt? Who actually wants all of these? Maybe what you need is the Monopoly before Monopoly. The Landlord's game. It's free real estate. Trading. The PDF is free to download online. Got a printer? Got a library card? You own the Landlord's game right now. You can also use your own player tokens of other public domain characters, like Winnie the Pooh, Sherlock Holmes, and the Machine Man. To get the authentic experience, I recommend using whatever you find in your pockets. Check the links in the description for the PDF, and remember, this is specifically for the first and second editions of the Landlord's game, not Monopoly. No one is going to get in trouble for downloading these photographs. So, get together some friends and try it out. What do you have to lose? Oh, but please tell them that it is basically Monopoly. They will not be happy if you surprise people with the new board game that is basically another Monopoly.
And now, back to the show.
If Georgists think landlords owe everyone else rent for the land that they're using, how do they plan on collecting it? Landlords aren't exactly well known for their charitable works. Well, Georgists proposed we get it back through a land value tax. In fact, land value is the only thing we need to tax. According to Henry George, there's an infinite capacity for labor and an infinite capacity for capital, but there is a finite amount of land. Unless you count the metaverse. Which you shouldn't. In the waves of supply and demand, that means that land value will be the stable element in the economy. And, because land rights are well documented, and hard to hide in a foreign bank account, it's also easier to prevent tax fraud. So, just get that single tax up and running and problem solved. Right? Right? Okay, I'm about to talk trash about single tax proponents, but after talking about the humble lives of Henry George and Elizabeth Maggie, I want to clarify a bit about the legacy of the single tax movement. I respect a lot of early single tax advocates coming up around the same time as Marx and having some of that same spirit in bettering the lives of the masses. I also understand where cities and municipalities are coming from when they adopt a land value tax policy. At that level of government, they have few revenue options. Some don't even get final say over things like zoning rights. If they have a single land value tax policy, it may well be because they only had one viable taxing policy left. The people pushing for a federal single tax are a different sort, though. I'm talking about folks like William F. Buckley Jr., who referred to himself as a closet Georgist to his buddies in the National Review. As a public intellectual, this was his pocket novel solution for keeping the economy buzzing while also avoiding the stench of touching other people's income and wealth, let alone smelling anything like that atheistic communism. I think the fact that Henry George's writing is so religious is a real draw to Buckley, who always framed the Cold War along religious lines. Then, there's the people who pushed the 2005 fair tax, a single tax for all good and service sales. Well, not every sale. Stocks, corporate mergers and acquisitions, capital investments, those are tax-free. This is a plan to benefit the everyman, I swear. Because it is so simple, everyone will be able to follow it too. We can get rid of that crummy Internal Revenue Services and just leave it up for the Department of Treasury to sort it out. An honorable mention goes to Herman Cain's 2012 campaign and their 999 tax plan, a 9% personal tax on income, 9% federal sales tax, and 9% corporate tax. Technically, it isn't a single tax, it's more like a 3-in-1 tax plan, but the way it is sold is similar enough that I think it's worth including. I mentioned virtual spaces like the metaverse, online servers trying to market themselves as the work environment of the future and attract companies as prime real estate for storefronts. These are invariably failures. No one wants to work these days, in Second Life, and virtual land has virtually no utility for investors. Or maybe the real issue is there is virtual land speculation where there should be a virtual land value tax. That's the premise of a thorough game developer essay by Lars Doucet and Dan Cook, which looks at MMOs and virtual spaces and applies a Georgist framework to making those spaces overall more successful. But I think that is indicative of how far Georgist thinking has moved past considerations for sharing the bounty of the creator to better everyone. Okay, so a single tax on land value. Problem solved. Right? Land value is only one kind of commons that gets exploited. It's ignoring air and air quality, water and water quality, energy resources, biospheres, and so on and so on. Land value is just one of the easier commons to track. Karl Marx had thoughts on Henry George.
The man is, in theory, completely behind the times. He understands nothing of the nature of surplus value. He has the repugnant arrogance and presumption which inevitably mark all such panacea breeders.
Giving taxes to the state and expecting everything to be distributed to the public is also very funny for anyone who has seen a breakdown of the federal budget. And while we're talking about the US government, who died and made them the boss of receiving land value? Oh, it seems like if we're talking about getting to the bottom of predatory land grabbing, that'd be a good place to start. I think Georgism can build toward a larger conversation on what is property, but as it stands, Georgism is so focused on the cat that they fail to put the land back in the landscape. Some of the changes from the Landlord's game to Monopoly trim out some of the more explicit Georgist messaging in the game. The Monopolist way to play is pretty much unchanged, but the anti-Monopolist mode is not included in the rules. Purchasing upgrades to property adds a wrinkle to the land rights-focused narrative as well. The chance cards, or so what cards, are there, but those cards were mostly quotes from famous people. I kinda think the quote cards undermine the point anyway. Playing it is supposed to give an experiential argument for breaking up land grabbing. The cards seem like they're doubtful that works. But even without the anti-monopolist mode, the quotes, and added upgrades, I think the message still comes through. All of these lands getting bought up by those that have the resources leaves little room for the have-nots. That is sufficient in and of itself. I think these quotes are fine in a manual for those that want to dig deeper and get a better understanding of where the creator is coming from and the kind of experience intended. There's something like this in the early Sims games, whose manuals came with a detailed bibliography, showing that the makers of the games did their homework. In SimCity's case, it is also a useful reference point for why the game may have a warped sense of what peak performance looks like. One of the inspirations for SimCity, Urban Dynamics, happened to come to the conclusion that programs meant to help support public welfare is actually detrimental, a book which also happened to influence the Nixon administration. To Urban Dynamics as well as SimCity, the crux of the matter was maximizing land value. When that's at the foundation, maybe that's why SimCity 4's default tax rate is the 999 plan. Stepping away from the original monopolist and anti-monopolist way to play, A lot has been built on top of playing Monopoly to reveal more about ourselves and how we engage with the systems we're entrenched in. A 1972 study led by Michelle Hall Williams at Portland State University used Monopoly to explore how people can lean on authority as a means of protecting their gains, and ultimately to serve as a pilot study in the substantial area of social control. Stick 4 college students in a room to play Monopoly, going off the official rules, and pay them minimum wage for their time. Observe how it goes. Now, try it again with a different group, but the winner gets twice as much. Oh, and now there's also Barry's Rule, named after Dr. Barry Leibowitz, the professor supervising the study. Observe how this goes, too. What behavior changes would bubble up now that there's money on the line? And how does the winner justify their winnings now that there is an added element of arbitrary chance from an authority figure? In this case, not much changed. The coveted reward was maybe getting a $12 check in the mail some weeks after the fact. That's pretty abstract. If the participants got antagonistic about anything, it was Barry's Rule, though they did ultimately play along with it. In 2012, Dr. Paul Piff did his own study at UC Berkeley. This time, it would only be 2 people playing at a time, and one would receive twice as much starting money, twice as much when they passed go, and rolled twice as many dice. The behavioral change is a lot more significant now. In the games that were observed, the rich players showed more outward displays, more likely to eat the pretzels left out for the participants, being braggadocious about how completely they are winning. They were ruder and less likely to acknowledge that the source of their winnings was an arbitrary coin flip at the start. And social scientists are continuing to use Monopoly to explore how systems shape our behavior. Marina Radilova, in her study, tweaks the methodology of the 2012 study, gauging how much players had a belief in a just world, or BJW, and then having them play that rigged game, seeing if there's a correlation between their underlying belief and their willingness to acknowledge an unjust situation. In this case, there was a high correlation between people with a high BJW in the rigged game attributing their success to internal causes. See, it was a matter of effort, not any unjust rules. A small note, but the players in these different Monopoly experiments are actually the ones teaching the social scientists about human nature in these scenarios. It's easy to think of knowledge as something that comes down from on high, wisdom from famous thinkers, the ordained manual from Barry, but the knowledge comes from everywhere, even something like playing a game together. In 2020, writer and activist Kimberly Jones spoke to the scale of generational wealth and generational harm to Black people in America as the most unbalanced game of Monopoly. That some people got to play 400 rounds before others got the right to move, and then for the next 50 rounds, anything the other players won was destroyed. How can we expect the other players to lift themselves up from their bootstraps when the game has been so rigged against them? How can we be surprised when people of color distrust law enforcement, when the law has been so unjust for so long? Monopoly, as it was designed, is supposed to highlight how bad this system is for everyone, and yet compared to the real world, it's idyllic. If only we had a level playing field, all starting at the same time, everyone having the same access to getting property, everyone getting the same pay for the same cycle. There's still destitution for all but one player at the end of the road, but until then, at least there's a sense of hope. Landlording and monopolizing has been the norm for so long in the United States that it can be hard to just think about the land, back before all of this. That's probably because those well-documented land rights don't like to acknowledge that before the system of land grabbing, there were communities like the Kiowa tribe, playing Zohn Ahl.
This land was made for you and me.
The design of the Landlord game, and later Monopoly, is inspired by this Native American game. It uses a four-sided board where you don't get to an end, but instead complete circuits, and earning a counter when you do so. Some of the landing spaces are dangerous though. If your piece lands on certain river spaces, you would lose a counter. Zohn Ahl isn't the sort of game you play competitively. It's more for playing together as a family when you have the space and a long amount of uninterrupted time. It's an opportunity to pass on a community's culture. That this board has been paved over again and again, I couldn't come up with a more apt metaphor for the foundations of land rights in the US if I tried. It's things like this that makes me aware of gaps in comfortable narratives of the Oregon Trail, of intrepid homesteaders setting down on plots of land to build their new homes. Narratives that omit things like the Dawes Act, which chopped up Native American land into individual plots with the goal of assimilating the people and the land. I really appreciate that there are games like When Rivers Were Trails that provide a counter-narrative for that history. For all the flack I give Georgism, I do want to credit the scale of their thinking. A total land value tax is basically nationalizing all land. That's pretty radical. Imagining a change-up that big feels necessary, especially when things are trending towards the unthinkable, like making water into a futures market. Where can we go to imagine solutions that meet the scale of these crises? Well, one of the charms of playing a game with people is getting to collaboratively imagine other scenarios and other rules unrelated to what's going on in the real world. It's within the magic circle. It's a play space with no real-world stakes. Why not experiment? The rules to Monopoly have been tweaked before. There's nothing stopping us from changing them again. Heck, you may have already done it, depending on what you think is supposed to happen when you land on free parking. We don't have to start the conversation from scratch either. Many indigenous communities have come up with intricate solutions to our colonialist, post-colonial world. What would something like land back even look like? Groups like the Yellowhead Institute have been putting serious thought into that, and I recommend checking out their website. Tristan Johnson at Step Back has also recently made a video dedicated to discussing the history and victories of the land back movement. We've all heard, don't hate the player, hate the game. It's a deflection technique for someone who got away with something that they may not think is fair, but is nonetheless how the system works. It's the fault to the system, not the individual, that someone is succeeding at the expense of others. If the game has been rigged for over 400 rounds, is still giving unequal opportunities that aren't being acknowledged, is designed with only one winner among a community of losers, is stolen, there's a lot of reason to hate the game. We don't have to play by those rules. We can throw the board across the room and make our own. Thanks for watching. For a deeper dive of the development of the Landlord's game and the dubious beginning of Monopoly, I recommend Tom Nicholas's video, Monopoly is Anti-Landlord Propaganda. I also recommend Polygon's article and video, Unboxing the Hidden Politics of SimCity, for a deeper dive of how SimCity has small government principles running under the hood. I gotta say though, I'm exhausted after talking about land rights. I think I need to escape to the one place that hasn't been ruined by capitalism. Space! Oh no.